I don't celebrate Mother's Day, really. I give her a phone call, but I have a good excuse for it. She lives really far away from me. I see her maybe once a year, and so I'm justified, okay? I don't feel that bad about it. But I love her. I love my mom. She's done so much for our family. She does this thing where, okay, look at me. I'm a full-grown man. She calls me my baby, and I'm not nowhere near a baby. I have babies myself, so it's not even, I'm not. And while the sentiment is kind of cute, the really annoying thing is she actually sometimes treats me like a baby as well, okay? She'll always give me advice about, what to eat, how to eat it, how to do chores, how to raise kids, how to avoid made-in-China products, no offense to China, and how to do my job at church even. And for those who know me, I have this really high tolerance level. But for some reason, my mom has this superpower where she can just say 2 or 3 comments and I'm flustered, okay? I'm triggered. She breaks past my wall of self-control and rational thinking and empathy. And I would bark back at my mom. I'm like, Mom, the things that I do, it's based on research and science, and compared to your Vietnamese propaganda newspaper, it's much better, right? And then we always get into this cycle during our visits, okay, where she would give me advice, my brothers and I would kind of talk back, and then we'll be in tension all the time. And then at a breaking point, my mom would be like, why are you guys so mad at me? I just love you. I want what's best for you. How come you're always yelling at me? I'm just trying to be a good mom. And then we'd feel guilty, and then we'd give her ways to love us. And she tries, and then she goes back to giving advice. And it's always the same cycle. It ruins every visit. And yeah, Christine was telling me one time that every time, so my brothers and I were full-grown men. Every time my mom comes, we regress to 12-year-old boys throwing tantrums at my mom. And it's I see it when she told me, but I can't do anything. I'm stuck in this toxic cycle with my mom. And I don't really have a happy ending for that yet. But I bring up that story because it's Mother's Day, and I just need a story about a mom. But 2, it's because today we'll be talking about toxic cycles. There are so many toxic cycles that we fall into. So there can be some about body image, where you have this very on and off unhealthy relationship with food and fitness. It can be with relationships, romantic relationships, where sometimes you see your friends, they keep falling into the same toxic relationship over and over again. You're like, what? Why? What are you doing? They're stuck in a cycle. It can be just mindsets and behaviors where you're just you know what? Screw it. Nothing I do matters. I never achieve anything. I always fail. Or no one likes me, right? And so these are toxic cycles. So I think the worst one is one that encompasses the rest of these, and it's the cycle of sin. Okay, so you hear the word sin, you're kind of grossed out. I feel grossed out by saying it. What is sin? We normally think of sin as just a list of things to not do, and when you do it, you sin. But I kind of want to shift your thinking of sin. Okay, so this is a pen, and I'm going to throw this pen through that door, okay? I know it's kind of far. You probably don't believe me. Do you think I can do it? I have a pretty good swing. Okay, are you ready? Disappointing, right? Super disappointing. That is sin, okay? The idea of missing the mark, I think that is sin. When you do something, when you live life that is completely off track with what life should be about, that is sin. And with that said, sin isn't just a one-off mistake once in a while. It can be defined as not living with the perfect values that God has intended. And so things like love and justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Whenever our lives are off track with that, that is sin. And so as I'm saying this, you're probably well, that's impossible. No one can live that way. That's exactly right. Every Christian, no matter how mature you are, you have to deal with this vicious cycle of sin. And if we're arrogant or apathetic to our sin, then it's going to cost us a lot down the road. And so that's our question today. How do we break out of the cycle of sin? We have 2 points. The first one is that we lean on God's character, and the second one is that we learn from sin's consequences. Our story, our Bible passage today, it picks up from where Enoch left off last week, where God has been showing his power and his faithfulness and his good plan to the Israelites over and over again through amazing miracles and like mind-blowing provision. And they finally made it to the edge of the rich and good land that God had promised them. But after sending out 12 spies, 10 of them came back, and they forgot about how good God was. They came back with this really bad report of the land, saying that the people there were scary and that they would get destroyed by them. And so our passage starts here, at the beginning of chapter 14. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and they wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why are you bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And then they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." They wanted to go back to Egypt instead of attaining this new, wonderful, abundant land that God had promised to give them. He was there with them. And can you imagine that? They want to go back to a place, if you don't know the story, they want to go back to a place where they were brutally oppressed as slaves. Okay, a place where they could be beaten to death anytime, where their children were taken and thrown in the river to be drowned. They preferred that over flourishing in this new land that God had promised them. And I think this is the worst kind of sin, right? A sin of just turning your entire life away from God. The only thing that eventually saved them from this rebellion was the plea of their leader, Moses, and the mercy of God, which leads us to our first point: lean on God's character. From what I told you about the story with my mom, you can probably imagine that when I was younger, lived with her, we got in a lot of these little fights where she would kind of, I feel like in my side, she was overbearing, she was nagging, and then I would kind of fight back against it. And then in moments of tension, I would kind of just go in my room, lock it, and then that way, like, I'm away from my mom, okay? And we're not talking to each other. A few hours later, I'd have to eventually go to the washroom, or I'd go out somewhere. And so I leave my room, and I remember I came out, and usually on the table was food. It was dinner. And my mom would leave these little ghetto handwritten notes. It's not exactly this, but it looks like this. Tells me to eat dinner and how to prepare it. And a part of me is like, why, Mom? Like, we're in the middle of a fight, right? I don't like you right now. You don't like me right now. Why would you make dinner for me? And the simple reality is that she loves me, right? And she cares for me. Even if we're fighting, despite what I've done, despite the ways I've hurt her, it's not really dependent on what I do or how I act, but it's because of her, who she is, and her love for me. Okay, so the Israelites, they were freaking out. They were planning to go back to slavery. And I didn't read this part, but they were deciding to kill Moses, Aaron, Caleb, and Joshua. And then God, Yahweh, he shows up and he's furious, okay? He's annoyed that despite everything that he's done for them, they have no faith. And they don't believe in his power and his good plan for them. And it's like, what more can he do? Right? He literally sent 10 plagues to free them from slavery. He's guided them through the desert with a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke. He's provided like bread and meat for them in miraculous ways. And he told Moses his plan. He was going to wipe out the Israelites, and he was going to start anew with Moses, and his people will be much greater. But Moses, despite being threatened with death, he actually appeals to God, okay? He talks to God, and he begs God to forgive his rebellious people. So, just a quick thought experiment. Normally, okay, let's imagine this. You mess up, and you really hurt somebody. How would you get that person to forgive you? So, think about it for 5 seconds. 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and then tell it to someone around you for 10 seconds. So how would you get someone to forgive you? 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, you got it? You got the perfect plan to get forgiveness? Okay, there's just so much you can do, okay? You can make excuses to justify what we did, right? So you can make excuses and blame other people or blame other factors. Or you can make it up to them, right? You'll be like, yo, I'll take you out for lunch as a sorry. I'll buy you this thing if you forgive me. Or, this one's a good one, we show them that we're different, that we deserve forgiveness. Or we promise that we will change. I'll never do that again, or I'll try harder. These are the main ways probably that you thought of. But Moses, he doesn't do any of that. Okay? Moses, he approaches God in the midst of his people's rebellion and asks God to forgive like this. This is from verse 17 to 20. Now may the Lord's strength be displayed, just as I have declared. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, and forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sin of the parents to the third, fourth generation. So, in accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now. Moses didn't give a good excuse for the Israelites' rebellion. And Moses didn't say that they've changed or repented. He asked for God's forgiveness simply based on who God is. That on his character, that on the fact that he, God, is slow to anger and that he's forgiving and that he's loving. He's simply saying, God, you tell us this is who you are, and please show it to us through forgiving us. And the crazy thing is, God does forgive them. Leaning on God's character breaks us out of the cycle of sin by changing the way we see and do life. Because we look at the Israelites and they're kind of stupid, right? They have God on their side. They're heading into this like abundant land. And instead, they're choosing slavery. And as I'm doing this, as I was kind of writing through this, I was really hyper aware of all the ways I enslaved myself as well. Even last night, I was working on the sermon, and then I picked up my phone, and then some of my friends are like in Cancun, so I'm just like scrolling through Instagram, and then for some reason, time just passed, right? I just like time traveled like 40 minutes into the future, and I'm like, oh no, right? I just lost 40 minutes of sermon prep. And I realized, I'm like, okay, I'm totally enslaved to this phone, and it's embarrassing because the night before, some of the youth led a lesson on being distracted by your phone, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's me. And you're enslaved by your phone, or maybe I'm enslaved sometimes by my reputation. I care what people think or about things I want. Facebook Marketplace literally has like, he's my slave master. I'm always looking on it. And we're slaves to all these things. These things have a hold on us. And while we're enslaved, right, when things go wrong, I try to fix it. And it's the same as, think of like a huge skyscraper, that's my life, and the foundation is broken and it's leaning over. And I grab like a first aid kit. And I grabbed a Band-Aid and I put it on the foundation, right? It doesn't do anything, right? It's kind of stupid. But I think it fixes it, but it doesn't. It won't do anything, but God's figured out a better way. In our story, Moses, he stands between the people's rebellion, between God's just wrath. And he begs God to forgive his people, to spare them. And what Moses is actually doing is that he's pointing to and he's foreshadowing and representing Jesus, right? Who not only stands between and God's wrath and asks God to spare and forgive us, but he goes beyond and he offers his life in our place. And that fixes it, okay? That rebuilds our foundation. That pays off our infinite debt that we can't pay off, but we sometimes think we can pay off. And we don't have to live a life trying to do things our way or meaninglessly chase after forgiveness or purpose. It's already given to us because of who God is. And so we're free. We're free from sin's hold. We're free to chase after things that matter and put our efforts toward what God is doing in our world. And so I think practically, what leaning on God's character looks like begins with confession. I don't like that word. I don't like doing that. But I think it begins with admitting that we can't earn forgiveness, but we can ask God for it because of who he is. I think the key to breaking the habits and cycles of sin is exposure. We have to make that sin known to ourselves, to God, and to others that love us. Second point is that we learn from sin consequences. Here's how God responds to Moses. It's in verse 20 to 23. The Lord replied, I have forgiven them as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who treated me with contempt will ever see it. We read this, and it's a little bit confusing to us because we're like, wait, didn't God just say he forgave them? Why are they still being punished? And the fact that they can't enter the promised land despite being forgiven teaches us something very fundamental. It teaches us that sin has consequences. Even if you're forgiven for it, and we don't like that, but that's the reality of sin. That's why God hates sin. It's weighty, it's toxic, it's destructive. If you're like me, and this does not sit well with you, there's a good chance that you and we struggle with some kind of entitlement. So, I know you're looking at me right now, and you see me as a saint, right? You probably see a little halo on top of me, right? No? Horns? Okay. I remember back in high school, don't know why I did this, but I was saying terrible and untrue things about a friend of mine behind her back. Don't know why I did it. I think it gave me a sense of power, or I had a hold on someone, or if I just fit in. Maybe the youth girls can tell me why. But it greatly hurt her, and it damaged her reputation. It changed the way others saw her, and after a while, I got confronted by her, and I said sorry, obviously. What else could I do? And she thought about it, and she said she forgave me. Great, right? We're back to buddies now. Like, we can be friends again. She stopped talking to me. And I felt a bit lied to, okay? Because she said she forgave me, and yet she treats me as if she didn't. And so I confronted her this time. I'm like, what gives? I thought you forgave me. And she's like, I forgave you in the sense that I wish the best for you, but I don't want a friendship with you anymore. I don't want to invest time into that. I don't trust you anymore. I didn't deserve that. And so being forgiven didn't mean it fixed the trust between our friendship. Being forgiven didn't mean that other people stopped seeing her a certain way because of the things I said. And me thinking that this cheap verbal sorry would undo everything I did just showed me how entitled I was. And there are really two things I can do with my disappointment about my consequences. The first one is I can stay entitled, right? I can blame other people. I can say that she's just overly sensitive and she has her own issues and it's not fair to me. But what that does is that just makes me increasingly bitter and inconsiderate. Or I can accept responsibility for my mistakes, right? And wrongdoings, and accept the consequences gracefully in a way where I can grow from it, where I can learn from it. Knowing that what I did was wrong, seeing how hurtful it was to me and to her, and not wanting to do it ever again. This is almost like a rhetorical option. Obviously, the second way is the right way to go about it. God has, in a sense, allowed us to face the consequences of our actions so that we can grow, right? So that we can mature, so that we can become more and more like Jesus. In Hebrews 12:6, the author writes that the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastises every son he receives. And reading this makes me think of Josiah, my son, and I imagine all the times in the future I'm going to have to eventually discipline him as he grows up. And so, just a random scenario, imagine he's on the playground, and he randomly just punches a kid in the face for no good reason. The worst thing that I can do is actually do nothing. okay? Or maybe even like defend his actions. Those are the worst things I can do, because what that will do is that he'll grow up believing that that's okay. And he'll be a nightmare to be around. And eventually he'll live this lonely, hated life where everyone avoids him because he can't socialize properly. I know that's a bit extreme, but that's just how my brain works. But the most loving thing for me to do is actually to discipline him. And the discipline would come from a loving hope that he would fix his habit so that he can grow up loved by all and influential to many. And so even while you are suffering the consequences of your mistakes, I want to encourage you to look for God's grace there. To take on a level of humility, to learn whatever you can, to reflect on it, to let it change you, and pray that one day that you'll be able to use this to help someone else with your story. Oftentimes, it's our greatest mistakes that become the most captivating stories. It doesn't mean that we should make mistakes on purpose. That would make you psychotic. But you should use those consequences as a means to grow. That concludes our message for today. But before we end, I want to look at the passage where Moses calls on God's character to forgive his people. And a lot of you know this, but Moses actually recites this from another place in the Bible, Exodus 34, 6-7, where God is describing to Moses his own character, his own presence, his own beauty, his own glory. And the first word he uses to describe himself is compassionate, or sometimes it's translated as merciful. And in Hebrew, that word is rachem. And what rachem literally means is a womb. That's a little bit weird, a mother's womb. And so God is painting this picture for us, that his compassion for us is like the boundless compassion that a mother has for her child, before the child has even done anything or accomplished anything. And so today, on Mother's Day, I want to thank moms for loving and caring in such a way that helps us see and understand God a little bit more. And in your mothering, you are bearing God's image. I think that is something you should be very proud of. And so thank you for sacrificing unconditionally for your children. Thank you for nurturing and maturing them physically and socially, mentally, spiritually. Thank you for the depth of love where you would give your own life to save them. Thank you for helping us understand the kind of love that God has for us. Happy Mother's Day.